This is the Samsung Galaxy S4. Released in April 2013, it would sell 20 million units within only 2 months, propelling further this new era of success for Samsung as they were more and more becoming established as a pillar of the Android smartphone market. The S4 would be one of the most popular phablets ever made, pushing the large form factor to more people than ever as smartphones transformed into media consumption devices rather than just phones. The 5-inch vibrant AMOLED display was unlike anything else on the market, and in combination with a fun build, solid hardware, and enough features to make your head spin, it was no wonder the Galaxy S4 became one of the best-selling Android smartphones of all time. Hey, how's it going? I'm Josh from 91Tech, and there are few phones as iconic as the Galaxy S4, and yet it's also somehow so forgettable. And I don't mean that in a negative light, it's just that this phone blends in with Samsung's plastic era of devices, looking very similar to both its predecessor in the S3 as well as the 2014 S5, which we recently reviewed, link in the description to that. Samsung also just released an absurd quantity of phones back in these days, specifically 56 phones in 2013 according to GSM Arena's Phone Finder tool. Now this does include some different variants of the S4 and adjacent models like the S4 Mini and S4 Active, but there's just so many devices that it's actually pretty impressive. But the Galaxy S4 does still stand out for really pushing the right buttons with consumers, hence its success. So today we're asking the question, how does the Galaxy S4 hold up approaching 12 years later?
Hey.
Sorry, I was just checking out your phone. That's the Galaxy S4, right?
Yeah, I just got it.
Did your video just pause on its own?
Yeah, it does it every time you look away from the screen.
And that's a big screen, too.
5 inches, HD.
Is that phone that you answer by waving your hand over it?
Yeah.
Is it? Am I doing it right?
Someone has to call you first.
Well, give me your number, I'll call you.
Yeah. Give me your number.
Come on.
Introducing the Samsung Galaxy S4. The next big thing is here.
If there's anything Samsung was nailing in the early 2010s for their smartphones, it was saying yes to the consumer. I talked about this with the S5, but their phones always just seem to cram in anything and everything you could ever desire. You want a big 1080p screen with vibrant colors? Sure, why not? Micro SD card slot and swappable battery? You got it. You want eye tracking functionality? The ability to detect when your finger is hovering over the screen, an IR blaster so you can control your TV, NFC capabilities, and even temperature and humidity sensors? I mean, those do seem like some very specific requests, but sure, they're all in the S4 for some reason. Knock yourself out. There's so much here, probably too much. But the hardware itself in front of us is refreshingly straightforward, so let's start with that. We're looking at a 5-inch Super AMOLED panel that was one of the earliest to rock a full 1080p resolution. This was up from 720p on the Galaxy S3 and marked a clear turning point where Samsung was surpassing Apple in the display department. This screen still looks really sharp thanks to its high pixel density and incredibly vibrant, probably oversaturated if anything, which was a common criticism back in this era, but there's no question it would have stood out when compared to an iPhone or even any Android competition. And it was really iPhone Samsung was positioning themselves to compete with. Their ads often poked fun at iPhones and their users, posturing Samsung's devices as much more capable and robust, which in fairness they often were, at least to some extent, like with this big beautiful screen here. 5 inches is actually quite small by today's standards, but you have to remember this phone is from 2013. The iPhone 5 had only just come out fall 2012, and Apple increased their screen size up to 4 inches, which felt significantly smaller than the 5 of Samsung here. If you wanted a bigger phone, as many people around this time really did, Samsung was the clear choice, and that's exactly why they were so successful. The bezels surrounding the display are actually on the thinner end for phones from this era, at least they seem that way to me, and we do have a simple plastic home button with no fingerprint sensor or biometrics at all. The S5 would bring one next year, but it's so painful to actually use that I almost prefer not having a fingerprint sensor, so I've got no complaints with the S4. Some front-firing speakers would have been nice, but overall from the front, the S4 is a really gorgeous phone, with the chrome-colored frame really contrasting well with the darker bezels. And the bezels here aren't really black, they're this deep blue color, it's really nice. I also actually quite like how rounded the corners are, maybe because it's just a bit different from phones today, but it makes the S4 feel a little smaller than it actually is, which likely would have been a plus for anyone who thought the phone might be on the big side back in 2013. From the front, this is a really great looking phone. Flipping the S4 over though, things are a little less straightforward. We have a glossy plastic backing here with this sort of pattern imprinted that adds a little bit of character. I don't personally like the feel of this phone very much though, as I prefer more matte plastic finishes over the glossy, kind of slippery feel these phones tend to have. The metallic looking frame might add an air of luxury, but well, this is an early 2010 Samsung, which means that sure enough, this is all plastic. I did say this with the S5, but painting the frame frame in chrome to make it look higher quality than it actually is just isn't something I approve of. I would have much preferred they just own the plastic, not try to hide it. It does look good, but it doesn't feel quite right. But when you're competing with the iPhone 5, which had that beautiful aluminum and glass design, well, at some point maybe just going with a simple plastic back like this is the way to go, especially when it can give you more options than any iPhone user can ever dream of. Accessibility here is the name of the game, and we can pop that plastic back off to see both the battery and micro SD card slot. Firstly, having the swappable battery is great for the longevity of a smartphone. Phone batteries do degrade over time, so being able to easily switch yours out at will means for potentially much better longevity. As for the expandable storage, the S4 started at 16 gigs, which wasn't a whole lot of space. There was also 32 and 64, but unlike iPhone, you could add a whole lot more storage for not much more money, and suddenly all that plastic doesn't really matter so much after all. We all know Samsung would eventually shift their smartphone design to be a bit more luxury oriented with the gorgeous glass Galaxy S6, but that phone would compromise on fan favorite features like the expandable memory, features that gave Samsung devices their identity, phones that say yes to the consumer rather than locking you down like Apple. I'm making a big deal about this because I'm trying to establish the mentality of consumers in 2013 and exactly why this phone is still probably the best-selling Android ever. I say probably, the numbers are a bit sketchy, but this does seem to be at the top with around 80 million units sold in total. Clearly something about this phone resonated with people. I don't hate this design, and I do think there's some charm to the build. From the front, I really love the look, but the back just is a step down. Now, did that actually matter to its users? Probably not, and even if some weren't fans, ultimately, you're gonna be looking at the screen, not the back of the phone. One has to wonder what would have happened if Samsung never pivoted with the Galaxy S6 and had kept up these plastic designs. What would the smartphone landscape look like today? We've lost so many options over the years that were once taken for granted, from micro SD cards and swappable batteries to even just headphone jacks. This was a very different era of Samsung, and one that had a lot going for it in 2013. The S4 itself really was a mild evolution, however, from the S3. The S3 had brought this sort of design initially, and the S4 as well as the S5 really just refined the framework further, as well as bringing more powerful hardware. And well, then there's the software with TouchWiz, and yeah, gives me chills up my spine even just to say that name, but we'll get to it. First, let's talk about the cameras. On the front of the phone, we've got a simple 2-megapixel sensor. It was plenty good enough in 2013, but it's pretty rough today. On the back, we've got the rear sensor with a slight camera bump, boasting an impressive 13 megapixels with video recording at up to 1080p at 30 frames per second. While we don't have anything fancy like 4K video on the S5, this was more than enough to compete with the other flagships of its era. No optical image stabilization is never great, but if you can stay relatively still when taking photos and maybe take a few just to ensure one turns out, the S4 can absolutely take a half-decent picture in the right situation. Ideally, you'll have good lighting like outdoors during the day. Indoors, the results are much more rough, with photos often being very blurry and grainy, which is in no way out of the norm for a 2013 phone. Smartphone cameras have come a long way, but there is a certain charm to these pictures for me. And again, the S4 is capable of taking a nice shot here and there. There's also this very odd feature where you can film yourself with the selfie camera as well as the rear camera at the same time, which feels gimmicky, but hey, maybe someone found it useful. All in all, if you can avoid low light situations, the S4 was plenty capable of capturing moments and memories, which is ultimately what matters most from any smartphone. As far as the technical specs go, there are multiple variants of this phone, many of them using an Exynos processor, but we'll just focus for now on what I have here, which is a North American model. We're rocking the Snapdragon 600 processor with 2 GB of RAM, standard stuff for an Android flagship of its time. The S4 shipped running Android 4.2.2 Jelly Bean and received about 2 years of updates through to Android 5 Lollipop. And I guess it's about time we talk about the software and Samsung's infamously bloated TouchWiz UI skin. Yeah, their software has come a long way in the past decade, that's for sure. Now, at first glance, things do seem fine, and as much as I might complain, truthfully, it's not as if TouchWiz is absolutely awful. The icon design is a bit older, which is fine. There's some pre-installed apps that don't need to be here, like I have Dropbox, Flipboard, TripAdvisor. Why do I have these? Typical Android phone. But almost worse than that, and very typical of Samsung, we've also got duplicates for every Google app out there. Why use the Play Store when you've got the Galaxy Store, Hub, and Link? Why use Google Assistant when you have S Voice or Play Music when you have Samsung Music? You get the idea. And and it's easy to feel overwhelmed by options when using this phone, even before we get into the ridiculous amount of features beyond just this. Performance is hit and miss, with a lot of basic UI stuff feeling smooth at times, but as soon as anything more intensive happens, we quickly see slowdown and lag. TouchWiz was never that well optimized in the first place, but it doesn't really matter. This phone is so far out of date anyways, you wouldn't want to use it in any practical sense. While certain elements of the S4, like the display, hold up incredibly well, it is still a 2013 smartphone no matter which way we twist things. If we really did want to push it a bit further, you could turn to a custom ROM, and there are some far more recent versions of Android you can install with Lineage OS and the like if you really wanted to for the fun of it, but for now I want to look at the S4 as it stands. So let's talk about the abundance of features, shall we? One of the defining traits of Samsung's old TouchWiz software on phones like the Galaxy S4 was the sheer number of features it packed in. Feature creep was a term thrown around a lot back in the day. Samsung seemed determined to differentiate its devices from the rest of the Android crowd by offering functionality you couldn't find anywhere else. On paper, I think this was a great strategy. After all, who wouldn't want a smartphone that does more? However, the sheer number of features often led to a cluttered experience that would overwhelm users. Let's just list some of these features, okay? Just some of them. Multi-window mode, allowing for 2 apps running side by side. Smart Pause, which paused video when you looked away from the phone. Smart Stay, which keeps the screen on as long as you're looking at it. Air View, which allows you to hover your finger over the screen to preview content. Air Gesture lets you swipe through things by waving your hand over the phone. Easy Mode, which simplifies the UI. I actually like this one, it's kind of cool. S-Beam, which allowed you to send files via NFC. Humidity and temperature sensors. Why are these here, honestly? There's an IR blaster, so you could control your TV with your phone. Look, these are just some of the many features, and you get the picture. While a few might be useful, I mean, I lose my TV remote all the time, would be cool to control it with my phone. In reality, the software was just too much, and some of these features absolutely tanked battery life too. Something like Smart Stay needs to use your camera to watch you, and that's going to use way more power, especially when you're already doing something else on your phone. Looking back, TouchWiz and the Galaxy S4 really as a whole is perfectly representative of this era of Samsung. It was a time when the company was willing to take risks and experiment with bold ideas, even if a lot of them didn't land. Many of the features introduced in TouchWiz have since become standard on smartphones, either through Samsung's refinement or adoption by other manufacturers. Samsung has always strived to say yes to the consumer, and you've got to respect that, regardless of whether you might love the S4 and its software or hate everything about it. While using the S4 isn't a particularly pleasant experience anymore, the hardware really does shine, and has held up far better than many a phone from 2013. The gorgeous high pixel density AMOLED display was unparalleled for its time, and that alone makes the phone feel far newer than it actually is. I could do without the plastic and the TouchWiz interface, but there's a reason the Galaxy S4 sold as well as it did. It's a heck of a phone, and one of the most influential smartphones of all time without any doubt. And so with that, I think I'm right about done here. It was fun to talk about the S4 today. Again, I did do a recent video on the S5 as well, which will be linked in the description. And if you want to see more reviews on old Galaxies, please hit that like button and consider subscribing for more content just like this. We do have a fun Discord. Come by, say hi, talk some tech. Huge shout out to the channel members for being amazing people, and thank you all so much for watching. I am Josh from 91 Tech, and I will see you all next time.